Welcome at the meeting of the Polish Council of Christians and Jews. We are the Christian-Jewish Dialogue Organization. We belong to the International Council of Christians and Jews. And this is our meeting, online meeting, devoted to the presentation of our annual award. The title Figure of Reconciliation is given to an individual, usually a foreigner, who has contributed significantly to the Christian-Jewish dialogue in Poland. And this year, we are honored to present this title to Yossi Klein Halevi from Jerusalem. Why? This will be explained by Zbigniew Nosowski, the other, together with me, co-chairman of the Polish Council of Christians and Jews. And at the same time, we are launching the Polish translation of Yossi Klein Halevi's book, Letters to a Palestinian Friend, Palestinian Neighbor, sorry, but that's a significant mistake, that has just been released. And Olaf Żylicz will be explaining the book and the series in which the book has been published by the publishers Austeria in Krakow. So welcome all who are members of the Polish Council of Christians and Jews, our friends, our colleagues, and everybody who is interested. Now, Zbigniew Nosowski, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Staszek. Well, dear Yossi, dear men and women of reconciliation of previous years, dear friends from the Polish Council of Christians and Jews, dear friends from wherever you are, and dear all watchers of this special event. My task here is to explain to you why Yossi Klein Halevi deserves to be granted by the Polish Council of Christians and Jews a honorary title, Figure of Reconciliation. For me, an answer to this question is a very simple one, and I understood it from the very first moment that I personally met Yossi in 2008. And when I had a privilege on this day to see how he listens to what others say and how he responds. In my opinion, a starting point of any dialogue is understanding one another's pain. That's why reconciliation, although it requires social and political dimensions, is foremost a spiritual effort. And Yossi Klein Halevi is, in the opinion of Polish Council of Christians and Jews, a master of such a spiritual effort. He is a man of reconciliation because he makes his best to understand other people's pain. He deserves this title because he is a bridge builder and a practitioner of dialogue, as well in his professional life as in his citizen activities. And now some more details. Yossi was born in 1952 in New York as a son of a Hungarian Jew who survived from the Shoah. He studied Jewish studies at the Brooklyn College and journalism at the Northwestern University. Being 30 years old in 1982, he moved to Israel and lives since then in Jerusalem with his wife, Sarah, and who is a landscape designer. Best greetings to Sarah as well. They have 3 children. He is a prolific and inspiring writer. His first book, Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist, told the story of his teenage attraction to Jewish militancy, and later subsequent disillusionment with extremism. The New York Times called this book a book of burning importance. Yossi experienced himself the bad sides of extremism and knows best how difficult the road toward openness and reconciliation is. 2 other of his books are very important for us today. The first one is Letter to My Palestinian Neighbor, a heartfelt plea for peace and new dialogue based on common ground in faith. Polish edition of this book has just been published by Austeria Editorial House, and Olaf Żylicz will tell you later more about it. Polish edition of the other book is also being prepared by Austeria Publishing House. It is the book At the Entrance to the Garden of Eden, a Jew's Search for God with Christians and Muslims in the Holy Land. The book was published in 2001. It is a book of a unique spiritual beauty. The novelist Cynthia Ozick called it a permanent masterwork, and the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Rowan Williams, called it extraordinary and heartbreaking, a book full of wonders. In the book, Yossi describes his spiritual experiences while traveling for 2 years as a Jew around Christian and Muslim holy places in the Holy Land. The book is full of empathy, respect, and love. My Jewish co-chair in the Polish Council of Christians and Jews, Professor Stanisław Krajewski, finds this book one of the deepest interfaith texts ever written. Unfortunately, the book was published soon before 9/11 World Trade Center attacks and received much smaller reception than it deserves. Most famous of the Yossi Klein Halevi's books is Like Dreamers, the story of the Israeli paratroopers who reunited Jerusalem and divided a nation. It describes fates of paratroopers who conquered Jerusalem in 1967, but later became activists of competing Israeli political camps. There is an opinion that this book is the best ever description of the soul of Israel. Professionally, Yossi Klein Halevi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, which is a leading center of Jewish thought and education. Together with Imam Abdullah Hantepli and Maital Friedman, Yossi co-directs the Muslim Leadership Initiative of the Shalom Hartman Institute. The initiative brings North American Muslims to Israel to learn about Judaism, Zionism, and Israel. Yossi has been also active in Middle East reconciliation work and serves as a chairman of Open House, an Arab-Israeli Jewish-Israeli center in the town of Ramla, near Tel Aviv. He writes for the opinion editorial pages of leading American newspapers. As you all know, in the contemporary world, religions are quite often seen as sources of tensions and even conflicts. People think religions give absolute answers and create absolutist problems. This is how many non-religious people see religions. Unfortunately, this is also the way how some religious fundamentalists see their own religions. Yossi Klein Halevi presents another approach. In his opinion, religion should not be a part of a problem, but rather a part of a solution, and even more, a source of a solution. Both in his books and in his life, Yossi Klein Halevi combines deep devotion to his own spiritual and religious tradition with an openness to others. His story of relations to Poland is a good example of it. He visited Poland a couple of times, but the first visit was the most important. He writes about it in the foreword to the Polish edition of Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. You all may be surprised to learn that it was this visit to Poland that directed him toward dialogue. Yossi writes even like this: I owe my passion for outreach and interfaith work to Poland, more specifically to a fateful encounter in Krakow with Dominican monks in the fall of 1989, just after the fall of communism. Yossi was at that time a young journalist, and he came to Poland to write about growing tensions between Poles and Jews over the Carmelite convent in Auschwitz. He recalls, before coming to Poland, I thought I had understood the problem. The church was attempting to Christianize the Holocaust and deny the victims their very Jewish identities for which they had been killed. But as I interviewed Polish clergy and journalists about the convent controversy, I realized the issue was far more complicated. In fact, neither Jews nor Poles understood the concerns of the other. Jews feared that the Holocaust, a specific crime with a specific address, was being universalized and therefore trivialized by the Polish Church. Yet for Poles, Jewish opposition to a convent was surely proof of an inherent bias against Christianity in Poland. What could be more natural than monastic prayer at the place where tens of thousands of Polish Christians, including many priests, had been martyred. It is there and then that 37 years old Yossi Klein Halevi understood that Jews and Poles should be able to accommodate each other's need for mourning and prayer without seeming to assault each other's deepest religious and historical sensibilities. Yet the most transformative experience that Yossi had in Poland in 1989 wasn't journalistic, but spiritual. He recalls it like this. One of the staunch defenders of the convent whom I interviewed was Father Wojciech Giertych, then master of students at Krakow's Dominican convent. After a difficult conversation between us, Father Giertych surprised me by inviting me to meet the student brothers. They have never met a Jew before, he said. It's important that they hear what you have to say. And I had never met monks or friars before, says Yossi. I grew up fearing Christianity. My father, a Holocaust survivor, told me stories of how the Jews in his Hungarian town had hidden him from their Christian neighbors during Holy Week, fearful of pogroms. But the eager and welcoming young faces I encountered as I entered the vaulted room of the priory immediately dispelled my fears. And they kept discussing for 2 hours. The meeting changed my life, writes Yossi Klein Halevi. I came away with the realization that we, religious people who cherished our respective traditions as well-traveled paths to God, needed to transcend the resentments we had inherited from the past. When I returned home, I wrote a series of articles explaining the complexity of the convent issue, and more broadly, the need for Jews to relate to Poles and the Polish Church in a more nuanced way. I became the advocate for Polish-Jewish dialogue, deepening friendships with Polish Christians and Jews who were working to create a new relationship between Poland and Israel and Jews around the world. Yossi Klein Halevi's attitude to Poland might be best noticed in February 2019. In the very middle of the government-provoked hectic controversy around Polish Institute of National Remembrance law, basically around term Polish concentration camps, Yossi wrote a piece on his blog at the Times of Israel entitled, I Love Poland. He claimed that a people deserves to be judged by its best, not its worst, and the best of the Poles are among the Jews' most trusted friends. As you can see, Yossi Klein Halevi not only writes about reconciliation, but also practices it. He built a society on mutual respect, a society based on mutual respect. In his last encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis calls this ideal social brotherhood. By the way, when I mentioned the Pope, there are at least 2 things that Pope Francis and Yossi Klein Halevi have in common. The first one is the title given to popes, Pontifex, Latin pontifex, what means a bridge builder. And Yossi Klein Halevi for sure is a bridge builder. The other thing is that it is a fact that they both, Francis and Yossi, even have a common friend. It is a Polish Dominican friar, Wojciech Giertych, who since 2005 has been theologian of the papal household. Yes, this is the same Father Giertych with whom Yossi had the stormy quarrel in 1989 in Krakow. By the way, I encourage all Polish readers to read Giertych's article in the winter issue of Więź Quarterly that has just been published. It is devoted to an issue of compromise. Legal compromise is not an ethical compromise. But coming back to Yossi. Yossi Klein Halevi writes, the Polish-Jewish encounter requires a capacity to balance contradictory and deeply painful memories and perceptions. Poland taught me how to listen, how to discover unexpected commonality, and overcome differences through a shared religious language and reconciliation, language of reconciliation. Poland also taught me that people of goodwill could continue to disagree about history and faith and still feel bound together in a shared human future. And now it's time for a kind of reciprocity. We in Poland are unable to listen anymore. We don't know how to be different from one from another and live together. We often think that my monopoly is better than yours. Thank you, dear Yossi and you, man of reconciliation, that Poland can now learn from you how to listen to others, how to understand each other's pain. My most sincere congratulations to you.
Good evening, everybody. Erev Tov Yossi, great to have you on board in this strange cross-galactical meeting we have. Let me start. I really feel privileged that with Staszek we could have our contribution in getting your book published in Poland. What is so unique that first of all we have it. The way to the book was pretty long. Some of you might know the book in the English version, which was the book was published by Harper Publishing House, the perennial editions. And why it's somehow specific, this publishing of the book, because the time is what we have. We came first of all to the situation when we have to get it published definitely this year, and it looked pretty difficult with all the economical challenges we had around, and Austeria, the fantastic publisher, Polish publisher of, we could say, the Jewish books, or in Poland. But what was beautiful, what I enjoyed so much, that we all involved, I would say the publisher-in-chief, the Wojciech Hornat, but also so much the beautiful, if I could say, translator, Maria Maku, who so personally approached the issue. And Staszek and me, we felt the book, I would say, must be published. And with much of help of different people, we managed. And we can consider it in more spiritual and very personal terms. And it was great. And maybe some effort makes even the book to be more valuable in a way. What I like so much, there are so many things I personally like about the book. One of the things is it's very simple, in this kind of simplicity when it shows the beauty. It's transparent to the message. It doesn't show, if I may say, on the so much on Yossi himself, although it is his story, his narrative, but it's very pure. It's like we have the books of the wisdom, which are to share the message and not so much to share the ego of a person. So even for this reason, it would be great to read it. But there are much more to that. One of the things when I started to read it, I started with dedication. Yossi Klein Halevi dedicated this book to for Abdullah Antelpi and Michel Oren, my partners, my brothers. So it shows us that for Yossi, that's a really interpersonal endeavor. It's not just, he's not a professor of dialogue of Department of Theology here and there. He's a man in a contact with real people around him, knowing them, cherishing, embracing, and if possible, making them friends. And that's a starter. The very first sentence of the books says, I call you a neighbor, yeah? The letters to the Palestinian neighbor. I call you the neighbor because I don't know your name or anything personal about you. It's striving, it's curiosity. You know, the Yossi is writing about the fact that he's living in the French Hill in the outskirts of Jerusalem, very close to the wall, overlooking the Palestinian or the territories behind the wall. And it's what I like so much, that it's not written to all the society, all the people, but to the one person. It sounds for me like the Levinas searching for the meeting and seeing the face and knowing the person, just another one as a representative of another community. he writes later on, we don't know ourselves, but our lives are entwined. And what also is so moving, how much you don't try to be, as I would say, Yossi, as I see you, a pure intellectual who just want to describe the situation of another person, like in negotiations. But you go into the shoes of the another. You write later on, how do you, to the neighbor, manage, if at all, to preserve a measure of normal life? As a Palestinian, you are denied the rights of citizenship that I enjoy as an Israeli. So many times you go so naturally, profoundly, and honestly, in my understanding, into the perspective of the other person. It's not a game. It's meeting. It's going out of your map into the trying to understanding the experience of those who are on the other, in many respects, on the other sides of the wall. I was very moved when you were writing about your early morning prayers, when the muezzin was calling to a morning prayer, and you describe that being fundamentally and faithfully Jewish in religious terms, you can adopt and adopt this calling of muezzin in the morning into your prayer as a signs of searching, in a very sincere searching for commonality between the faiths, but also personally, as I understand, between you and them and him, the neighbor praying so close to you across the wall. Zbyszek Nosowski has mentioned your traveling to the more Palestinian territories. You've been a soldier there, and as far as I remember, in 1990, and then 10 years later, you made in late 90s, you made a trip before the wall was constructed to the territories to meet and to meet those Palestinians in the very depths of their faith and very depths of their spiritual experience. What I like it so much that you have written, I went there just to listen, to learn, not to share my story. Because each and every one of them knows, especially nowadays in Poland, as Zbyszek Nosowski has mentioned, we are not listening. We are just, most often, at best, we are not shooting at those who are not sharing our ideological visions. And he went there, you know, the Israeli former soldiers goes to Gaza. And you beautifully write then how you meet the sheikh with whom you pray together with other Muslim people in Gaza as a humble pilgrim. It's a matter of being brave. It's a matter of your openness. And it's a matter of your learning and how you can describe your enriched spiritual experience through playing in one line with the Muslim people, and especially this sheikh who made you a sort of a friend in a profound, not the Western understanding of the term being friendly, but really friends, somebody who is important in the life with whom you share the values. And you're told, surprisingly, maybe for some, that after a year of this contact, you started to love Islam, still being so much the faithful and committed citizens of Israel, believing that it's God's will to have the nation back to the Eretz Israel, and also a very faithful follower of Jewish religious tradition. You've written, I started to love Islam. And as a reflection, what we can find in the book, you are writing, the interfaith encounter sanctifies the God's name. What is really great in your writing, that you are not losing the realistic perspectives. You clearly show the challenges. You know how much the religions can be part of a problem, not as Zbyszek Nosowski has mentioned, that you can also see the power of religion to be a source of a solution. And as you were as Yossi Klein Halevi was in Gaza to learn, then this book I find, and you write this way, in this vein, that the book Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, it's to show your perspective. But it's like the Nelson Mandela has told, the great leaders speak last. So first, for a couple of years, publicly, you were so much listening to the Palestinian perspective. Now you want to share it, to say to them how you find your Jewish path in religious terms, how you find and discovered being Israeli citizens, and understanding how much they cherished and loved the land of Israel is to be shared between two nations, with all the suffering around and with all the openness, and you show it. And what is, I would say, very universal in what you are citing, it goes your book much beyond the issues of course, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has a universal value. It pertains to the world, the small lands divided between nations, and the tensions it has an impact on the world. But what is a fantastic learning, I would say, for those groups, peoples, who are nations, religions, who are in a difficult, challenging situation with difficult past. And if I to summarize what I take from your book, Yossi, it's that you start with yourself. How I read your path to reconciliation, starting with oneself, to understand myself, who I am, to understand my tradition well, but also my limitations. And you beautifully showed how you can transgress your past of the resentment you had towards Christianity and all those who were enemies to the Jewish nation. You know yourself, you know your tradition, and you look in this tradition what can be made to share it with others. And then you are making an effort to learn another through listening, but experiencing together. It's not so much about theology. And then you try to bring together this perspective and show that on different scale, smaller or bigger, we can bring a change. And it's in my best understanding of the message, we can really learn from this how to make tikkun olam in our private life and in the social life. Yossi, toda rabba.
Dzień dobry, everyone. Shalom. Greetings from Jerusalem. I'm so moved, Olaf, Zbigniew, Staszek, listening to all of you speak and teaching me, explaining to me really the framework for what it is that I've intuitively been trying to do, but you've given me a conscious language that really helps me understand more clearly what I've been groping to do all these years. I have to say that there's no event that I've participated in that has given me more pleasure and has meant more to me than this event and this honor. And the reason is as Zbigniew, as you referred to in your talk, Poland changed my life. Coming to Poland in the fall of 1989, that extraordinary moment, that miraculous moment when the Iron Curtain began to fall, when Poland began the process that led to the defeat of the Soviet Union, the world's most powerful totalitarian empire that one day was invincible and seemingly the next day disappeared. Of course, for those of you who lived under the Soviet Union, it did not feel that way at all, but it certainly seemed that way to us outside of the Soviet bloc. And to be in Poland in the fall of 1989 was to share in a great Polish-Jewish victory. Now, the war against the Soviet Union, the pride of place in bringing down the Soviet Union belongs without question to the Polish people, to the Polish Pope. It was Poland that gave the answer to Stalin's sarcastic question, how many divisions does the Pope have? But at the same time, the Jewish people, I believe, were in the second wave of this war against the Soviet Union, which to my mind was the great war against evil in our time. I grew up in the Soviet Jewry protest movement in New York of the 1960s and 1970s, an astonishing movement that united Jews around the world and that sustained itself for a quarter of a century and lost none of its intensity. If anything, this movement built its momentum through the years. At the same time, we saw the astonishing revival of Jewish life, Jewish pride in the Soviet Union. And the refuseniks, who really became the first minority within the Soviet Union to openly revolt against Soviet rule. And so I think of Poland and the Jewish people, the Polish people and the Jewish people, as being allies, even if we weren't necessarily conscious of it, but being allies in our generation's great war against evil, spiritual evil. And I was thinking just before this event began, I was thinking back to December 1970, literally 50 years ago, to the Leningrad show trial of a group of Zionists who were accused of trying to hijack a plane out of the Soviet Union to Israel. Many of you will remember those days. I was a teenager, as you heard from Zbigniew, still very much in my extremist period. And I remember one demonstration. This was this late December 1970. We had a march in New York City to the Soviet UN mission. And at one point, there was a merger of another demonstration. December 1970 was also a very significant moment in Poland. There was unrest and against the communist regime. And so Polish Americans were demonstrating in solidarity with the Polish uprising. And for a brief moment, these two demonstrations converged. I think very uneasily. Neither of us quite knew what to do with the other. And I remember this image of seeing the Polish flag and the Israeli flag flying together in the streets of New York, feeling and wondering, what is this? What are these flags doing together? And the image was so unsettling that I remember this 50 years later. I'm sure I was not the only Jew and probably not the only Polish American there who had a similar experience. And so coming to Poland in the fall of 1989 was this shock of recognition that my deepest allies in this struggle against the Soviet Union was this country that I thought I had nothing in common with. And that's really saying it in a very understated way. So in retrospect, the Polish and the Israeli flags flying together at an anti-Soviet demonstration was exactly right. It was the exact reflection of the role that our two peoples played unknowingly together in this decisive struggle. Now, as you mentioned, Zbigniew, this was also the time of the Carmelite convent. And my education began with a visit to Stashek and Monica, whom I knew from an interview that Stashek had given to a Jewish magazine that I wrote for, Moment Magazine, an American Jewish magazine. Stashek had been interviewed in the 1980s, and I thought, if I ever get to Poland, I have to meet this guy. And I knocked on their door, and they welcomed me. And I said to them, I'm here to write about Poland in this moment, and also the convent. And Monica and Stashek very gently suggested to me that I might want to speak to Polish Catholics who were taking the position of the Jewish community on this issue, who had publicly and courageously sided with Jewish sensitivities. And I remember Monica saying to me, you might want to ask them what the convent means to them as Polish Catholics, even though they had taken the Jewish position. Ask them what it means to them to have nuns praying in Auschwitz. So they sent me to some of their friends. I met with Krzysztof Ślewiński, the journalist. I met with Stefan Wilkanowicz, with Father Michał Tchaikovsky. These were all people who had taken a very brave stand against the popular position in Poland at the time and sided with Jewish sensitivities on this issue. And so I asked them. I remember asking Krzysztof Ślewiński, what does it mean to you when you see nuns praying in Auschwitz? And he began to cry. And he said, for me, it's like the descent of the Holy Spirit in this place of evil. I could hear from Ślewiński what I might not have been able to hear from some others, because I knew that he was listening to me as a Jew. And that was my first lesson in empathy. That was my first lesson in how reconciliation work begins. It begins by reassuring the other side that you're listening to their pain, that you're interested in their narrative. You're not just interested in explaining your story. And if you do that, you create an opening, and this is what I experienced in Poland. I wanted to know, what is it that we Jews had missed? What was it that we didn't understand about Polish sensitivities? We were each side was so overwhelmed by its own emotions on this issue that we had no place for understanding the emotions of the other. I remember Ślewiński at one point said to me, you know the difference between religious passion and religious fanaticism? He said, the fanatic can only hear a reflection of his own faith, his own pain, his own concerns. That was one of those moments when something switched. I had wonderful teachers. I had really the best teachers in the ways of reconciliation. And I also learned in that visit that it was no coincidence that the one man who had done more to bring Christians and Jews together in 2,000 years was the Polish Pope. Now, it was fairly conventional wisdom among Jews that this Polish Pope was Philo-Semitic, despite the fact that he was Polish. And what I learned in Poland was that the Polish Pope was Philo-Semitic precisely because he was Polish. And that was another shock to my tender Jewish sensibilities, to realize that there's something essential that we were missing in this story. Now, what I learned from my teachers about the Auschwitz convent, the shock for me was realizing that Poles and Jews were actually not speaking about the same place when we spoke about Auschwitz. Poles were speaking about Auschwitz I, the concentration camp, where tens of thousands of Polish Catholics, including many priests, had been killed. Jews were speaking about Birkenau, Auschwitz II, which was the death camp. We thought we were speaking about the same place, but we were actually speaking about very different sites. It made perfect sense to me that there would be a convent in Auschwitz I and not in Birkenau. Birkenau is the graveyard of the Jewish people. Auschwitz I belongs to Poland and other nations whose people suffered and died there. My takeaway from this was that so often, not always, sometimes we have feuds because we understand each other very well. Sometimes we have conflicts because we really don't understand what we're arguing about, or we think we're all arguing about the same issue, but we're actually arguing about a very different emotional landscape. And so these are some of the lessons that I've tried to apply to the conflict that I live with most intimately, which is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The conflict that I live with as my landscape, looking literally now outside my window across at the lights of the Palestinian village of Anata, right across the way. It feels so intimate, and yet it is an untouchable reality for both sides. The more that I immersed in trying to understand the source of the Polish-Jewish historical conflicts, or very different historical memories of the same events, the more I realized many of these conflicts are not about tangible issues, but intangible issues. And so in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, it is not primarily about borders and settlements and holy places. It is about all of those issues. But those are consequences of the conflict. The root cause of this conflict are the intangible issues, the mutual fears, the sense of identity, of the sense of indigenousness, of belonging, the fear that my history is being stolen from me, isn't being recognized. And so the intangibles of identity and memory, this is what the conflict is about. And that is something as well that I learned from my teachers in Poland. And, I'm not a relativist. I don't believe that everything is narrative. Well, I have my narrative, you have your narrative. I deeply believe in the truth of my people's story. But I also know that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a war over competing narratives. And that just as neither people is going to disappear, neither narrative is going to disappear. These are two very powerful stories. And my definition of who the Jews are is that we are a story that we tell ourselves about who we think we are. And that's probably true for all peoples. And there is no possibility of one narrative in this conflict vanquishing the other. We are fated to live with these two conflicting narratives. Now, as an Israeli, I will never agree with Palestinians about who began this conflict in 1948, who is responsible ultimately for the refugee problem, why peace failed during the Oslo years, who is responsible for the 4 years of suicide bombings that began in the year 2000. I know my truth, but I also know that Palestinians believe the exact opposite narrative. And so my attempt in this book is to, on the one hand, explain my story to my neighbors, but to also create a space where I can hear their story. And in a way, it's like our conflict over the convent. Neither side was acting, as it turned out, with bad faith. In fact, quite the opposite. I would argue that both the Jewish side and the Polish side were acting passionately out of good faith, out of the deepest source of each side's sense of what their faith commitment requires in this situation. But we weren't hearing the other side. It's my understanding of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Each side is not acting, neither side is acting out of bad faith, but quite the opposite, out of the deepest commitment to what each side believes is an expression of their faith. So, for example, on the Jewish side, the Jewish people, given our history, and I don't only mean the history of persecution. You know, usually when you say, given our history, it means the persecution, especially if we're speaking in a Polish Jewish context. But actually what I mean is, given our history of longing for the land of Israel, given the centrality in Judaism and Jewish identity that the land of Israel played through 2,000 years of exile, given the vicarious indigenousness with which we continued to hold on to the land of Israel, even as we lost our physical presence there, the Jewish people had no choice but to sooner or later try to translate longing into actual return. And so the return to the land of Israel comes out of the deepest, authentic place of Jewish memory and Jewish faith. We had no choice to return. But the Palestinians and the Arab world generally, given their history of resisting colonialism, of resisting waves of invasion from the West, they had no choice but to see our return, not as a return, but as one more colonial invasion, and to keep faith with their history to try to resist our return home. And that's the tragedy of this conflict. In the same way that the tragedy of our conflict over the convent was that each side was playing out an essential understanding of its own history, of its own faith, that is what, to my mind, that is what this conflict is about. And so each side has one overriding need in this conflict, and that is the need to be heard and to be validated. Precisely what I experienced in 1989 over the convent, that is really what each side most urgently needs from the other. In the book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, I had one very easy decision and one very difficult decision to make. The easy decision was that I knew I would end the book with the responses that I received from Palestinians. I knew that I would include those responses in the book, in the subsequent edition of the book. The first edition of the book was just my letters to my neighbor. I invited my neighbors to respond. The book was translated into Arabic, and the Arabic translation was placed for free downloading on the web. I began getting responses. So I knew that I would include some of those responses in the next edition of the book. Difficult decision was, do I give the Palestinian letter writers the last word in this book? The reason this was such a difficult decision is because this is a book that I wrote to defend the Israeli story. And if I'm giving the last word in this book to the counter narrative, to Palestinians who are attacking my version of history, which they all do to one extent or another in their responses to me, then I took the risk of leaving the reader with a narrative that I personally find very problematic. The narrative that competes with my story, to some extent tries to delegitimize my story. But in the end, I did make the decision to conclude the book with their letters and not respond to their letters as I thought I might do in the book. And the reason for that was I wanted to honor their courage, their goodwill, but also I wanted to try to model what a respectful, passionate disagreement between Israelis and Palestinians might look like. Because again, we disagree about everything. And this book is not a search for a shared narrative. A friend of mine who was on the Palestinian negotiating team at Camp David, the ill-fated negotiating attempt at Camp David in July 2000, told me the story that at one point in those negotiations, someone had the terrible idea of trying to come up with a shared narrative that the Israelis and Palestinians could agree on. And he said it almost destroyed the negotiations then and there. Of course, there were other issues that ultimately destroyed the negotiations, but that was really a case in point that our quest should not be to achieve some kind of artificial agreement, but to try to achieve a way in which we can passionately disagree, but with respect. And so that, in the end, is what I hope this book can make a contribution to. I just did an event with a group of high school students in America a half hour before this event began. A group of students who are reading this book. They're all writing letters in response. It's a wonderful educational project. And one of the students asked me, do you feel that this work has any hope? Don't you feel that the conflict is so overwhelming that in some sense this is really an act of futility? And my response was that I can only respond to you as a religious person. And that is that I believe that one of the ways that God works in the world is by looking for points of entry, points of goodwill, people who are trying to do God's will, who are trying to serve humanity in the best way they can. God is able to use those points of entry into the human mess, magnify the reach of what each of us would be able to achieve, because really on our own our reach is very limited. But God can use our gestures, our actions in ways that can reverberate far beyond maybe what any of us will ever know we've achieved. And that's the best that I can suggest, because on the face of it, this conflict really is hopeless, although perhaps a little bit less hopeless than it was a few months ago, given the unexpected outbreak of peace agreements between Israel and Arab countries, which is a discussion in and of itself. But I feel in the end that our efforts are greater than the sum of their parts when they are done from a place of goodwill. And that's what I would really like to say to all of you at the Council. The work that you're doing is just really heroic. And, you know, for Jews around the world and for Poles, I think, each people looms very large in the mythic imagination of the other. We each have an outsized place that we play, and not, as we all know, not always in the most positive way. Believe very deeply that we need each other in order to grow and to heal as peoples, as wounded peoples. And that is what I learned in 1989, because what Poland did for me is help me heal. It helped me heal as a traumatized second generation. It helped me grow, and it allowed me to move past the victim identity, which is really an identity that Zionism set out to free the Jews from. The whole purpose of Zionism, in a way, was to free the Jews of a victim identity. And I think that in order for us as a people, and perhaps this is true for you as well in Poland, to take this next step, we need each other. We need to be able to overcome this deep trauma that 70 years later continues to sabotage our relations, and to transcend, but in a way that we can only do together. And there are so many people that I'm seeing on this call who I would love to greet personally, and forgive me all for not mentioning each of you, but I just send you all my love and my gratitude. And what I do want to thank those in particular who made the Polish edition of Letters possible. And Olaf, who really was indefatigable in pushing this through. Marysia Makuch, with my beloved friend and gifted translator, and Janusz Makuch, who isn't on the call now, but my soul brother, I send my love to, and Staszek and Monica and Zbigniew, all of you who really made this possible, and I feel this great sense of gratitude to all of you, and I just can't wait to hold the Polish edition in my hands. I haven't gotten it yet. Looking enormously forward to that. And so thank you all very much.